Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another chilling collection of confessions pulled from the archives of human terror. In this episode, we will walk alongside 6 individuals whose simple journey home became a descent into nightmare. These accounts have been reconstructed from police reports, emergency dispatch recordings, and personal testimonies shared in confidence with law enforcement and mental health professionals. Each story represents a documented case where an ordinary evening walk transformed into an encounter with forces that prey upon the vulnerable and isolated. The names and specific locations have been modified to protect those who survived these ordeals, while the essential truth of their experiences remains untouched. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for authentic horror content that emerges from the darkest corners of human experience. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when another buried file surfaces from the shadows. My name is Patricia, and I work the night shift at a 24-hour diner in downtown Portland. I have always prided myself on being street smart and independent. After 6 years of walking home alone at 2 in the morning, I thought I had seen everything the city could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened 3 months ago has changed how I see every shadow, every reflection, and every person who walks behind me. This is not a story I tell lightly, but after what I discovered, I believe other people need to know. I started working at Mel's Diner when I was 22, fresh out of college with a psychology degree that was not getting me anywhere. The night shift paid better, and I am naturally a night owl, so it seemed perfect. The diner sits on Southeast Morrison, just a few blocks from the Hawthorne Bridge. It attracts an interesting mix of late-night characters: cab drivers grabbing coffee between fares, hospital workers ending their shifts, insomniacs seeking pie and conversation, and the occasional drunk trying to sober up before heading home. My apartment is exactly 12 blocks north on 23rd Avenue, a straight shot through a neighborhood that transitions from commercial to residential. The walk takes me about 25 minutes at a comfortable pace. I pass the same landmarks every night: the vintage clothing store with the mannequin in the wedding dress, the coffee shop with the chalkboard menu still visible through the window, the small park with the playground equipment that looks ominous in the amber streetlight glow, and finally, the stretch of craftsman houses that leads to my building. For years, this routine felt safe and familiar. Portland is not like other cities. People here tend to keep to themselves, but in a respectful way. I rarely encountered anyone who made me uncomfortable, and when I did, they were usually just drunk college kids who were more obnoxious than threatening. I carried pepper spray more out of habit than genuine concern, and I knew which houses had lights that stayed on all night, which meant someone was probably awake if I needed help. The first time I noticed him was on a Tuesday night in late July. I was leaving the diner at my usual time, 2:15 in the morning, after finishing the closing routine. The air was warm and thick with that summer humidity that Portland gets when the marine layer rolls in from the coast. I was tired but not exhausted, looking forward to unwinding with a book before trying to sleep as the sun came up. I was about 3 blocks into my walk when I became aware of footsteps behind me. This was not unusual. Other people work late shifts, and plenty of folks are out at that hour for various reasons. What caught my attention was the rhythm. The footsteps seemed to match my pace exactly. When I walked faster, they walked faster. When I slowed down to look in a shop window, they slowed down too. I turned around casually, pretending to check my phone, and saw a figure about half a block behind me. It was a man, average height, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing about his appearance was particularly memorable or threatening, which is probably why I dismissed my unease as paranoia. I continued walking, but I paid more attention to the sound of his footsteps. They stayed consistently the same distance behind me. When I reached the small park, I decided to test my suspicion. Instead of walking straight through on the main path, I took a detour around the playground equipment. The footsteps followed the same route. My heart rate picked up slightly, but I told myself this could still be a coincidence. Maybe he lived in my neighborhood and was simply taking the same route home. I reached my apartment building without incident. The man continued walking past as I climbed the steps to my front door, and I caught a glimpse of his profile. He appeared to be in his 30s, clean-shaven, with light hair visible under the cap. Nothing about him seemed particularly threatening in the few seconds I saw him clearly. I went inside, locked my door, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was not right. 3 nights later, on Friday, the same thing happened. This time, I was more alert from the beginning of my walk. The diner had been busier than usual, and I did not leave until almost 2:30. I was mentally reviewing my weekend plans when I heard the footsteps start up behind me, maybe 2 blocks from the diner. The same measured pace, the same consistent distance. This time, I was certain it was the same person. The silhouette was identical, down to the baseball cap and the way he held his shoulders. I tested him again by stopping to tie my shoe, even though it did not need tying. The footsteps stopped. When I started walking again, they resumed. The spacing never changed. He stayed exactly half a block behind me, close enough to keep me in sight, but far enough away that casual observers would not connect us. I began to feel genuinely afraid. This was not a coincidence. Someone was deliberately following me, and they were good at it. The consistency of the distance, the way he matched my pace, the fact that he appeared to know my routine well enough to be waiting for me. This suggested planning and patience. I started thinking about all the crime shows I had watched, all the psychology classes I had taken, and none of it was comforting. When I reached the park this time, I took a completely different route. Instead of going around the playground, I cut through the basketball court on the far side. The footsteps followed. I stopped abruptly and turned around, hoping to catch him off guard. But he had stopped too and was examining his phone, looking for all the world like someone checking directions or messages. I reached my building with him, still maintaining that same distance behind me. This time, instead of going inside immediately, I pretended to have trouble finding my keys. I fumbled through my purse while watching his reflection in the glass door. He slowed his pace and seemed to be paying close attention to my building. But again, he walked past when I finally went inside. That weekend, I could not stop thinking about it. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? A man walked behind me on public streets and did not approach me or threaten me. I had no evidence of any crime or even clear intent to commit a crime. I started researching stalking behaviors online and learned that what I was experiencing could be a precursor to more serious harassment. But it could also be someone who happened to work a similar schedule and live in the same area. The following Tuesday, I decided to take action. I left the diner at my usual time, but immediately turned east instead of north, taking a completely different route that would add about 10 minutes to my walk, but would take me through a more populated area with better lighting. If someone was genuinely following me with bad intentions, they would have to adapt to this change. The footsteps appeared within 2 blocks. My blood ran cold. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone was actively tracking my movements, and they were prepared for route changes. This person had been watching me long enough to know my habits and was dedicated enough to their surveillance to adjust when I deviated from my normal pattern. I stayed on the busier route, walking past a 24-hour grocery store and a gas station that always had customers, even at this hour. The footsteps maintained their distance. When I finally turned north toward my neighborhood, taking a route that would bring me to my building from a different direction, the follower stayed with me. This time, I was determined to get a better look at him. As I approached my building, I ducked into the alcove of a neighboring business and waited. From this position, I could see anyone walking up the street toward my building. Within a minute, he appeared under a street light, and for the first time, I got a clear view of his face. He was younger than I had estimated, probably late 20s, with pale skin and light brown hair. His features were unremarkable, the kind of face you might see anywhere and not remember. He was wearing jeans and a dark windbreaker over a plain t-shirt. What disturbed me most was his expression. He was not looking around nervously like someone who was lost or confused. He was focused and purposeful, scanning the street with the methodical attention of someone conducting surveillance. He stopped directly in front of my building and stood there for several minutes, looking up at the windows. My apartment is on the 3rd floor, and I realized with a sick feeling that he might already know which windows were mine. He pulled out his phone and appeared to be taking photos or notes. Then he walked to the corner and disappeared around the building. I waited another 10 minutes before leaving my hiding spot and going inside. I was shaking as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Once inside, I immediately called in sick for the next night. I needed time to think and plan. This was clearly not going to resolve itself, and I was not safe continuing my normal routine. I spent the next day researching my options. I learned that Oregon has relatively strong stalking laws, but they require evidence of repeated harassment and a credible threat. I also discovered that many stalkers begin with surveillance behavior exactly like what I was experiencing. The fact that he was taking photos of my building suggested he was escalating his level of attention. I decided to involve my manager at the diner. Mike has worked there for 15 years and has seen every kind of situation you can imagine. I told him about the follower and asked if he had noticed anyone hanging around the restaurant who seemed out of place. Mike took my concerns seriously and said he would pay attention to the customers and anyone lurking outside during my shifts. When I returned to work 2 nights later, I asked Mike to walk me out at closing time. We left together through the back door, which opens onto an alley that connects to a different street. If my follower was waiting at the front of the restaurant, this might throw him off. We made it about 4 blocks before Mike spotted him. The man was walking parallel to us on a side street, maintaining visual contact, but staying at a distance. Mike wanted to confront him immediately, but I convinced him not to. I was afraid that direct confrontation might escalate the situation or drive the follower to change his tactics in ways that would make him harder to track. Instead, we called the police from Mike's cell phone. 2 officers met us at the park halfway through my normal route. I explained the situation while Mike kept an eye on the follower, who had stopped about a block away and appeared to be waiting to see what would happen. The officers were professional and took my concerns seriously, but they confirmed what I had suspected. Without evidence of threats or illegal behavior, there was not much they could do immediately. They approached the man and spoke with him, but he claimed to be walking home from his job at a warehouse and said he was not aware that he was making anyone uncomfortable. The officers got his identification and confirmed that he lived in an apartment about 6 blocks from my building, which would make our routes legitimately overlap. His name was David Chen, and he had no criminal record. The officers advised him to take a different route home to avoid any appearance of harassment, and they advised me to document any future incidents and call them immediately if he approached me or if I felt threatened. David Chen apologized to the officers for any misunderstanding and walked away in the opposite direction. I thought that might be the end of it. Mike walked me home that night, and I felt relieved that the situation had been addressed without escalating into something more serious. I was wrong. The next night, the footsteps were back. This time, David was more careful. He stayed farther away, sometimes crossing to the opposite side of the street. But he was definitely still following me. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived at our agreed meeting spot, he had vanished. This pattern continued for the next week. David became increasingly sophisticated in his surveillance. He would sometimes walk ahead of me and then double back, or he would parallel my route from several blocks away and only become visible when I was nearly home. He seemed to have studied the patrol patterns of local police and knew how to avoid being spotted when I called for help. I started varying my schedule and route randomly, but it did not matter. He always found me. I began to suspect that he was watching the diner and timing his surveillance to begin when I left work. Mike confirmed this theory when he spotted David sitting in a car across the street during my shift, pretending to read while actually watching the front door. The situation reached a crisis point on a Thursday night in late August. I had been dealing with David stalking for almost a month, and the stress was affecting my sleep, my work performance, and my mental health. I was constantly anxious, jumping at every sound and checking over my shoulder compulsively. I had started carrying my pepper spray in my hand during the entire walk home. That night, I left work at the usual time, but took a route I had never used before, hoping to break the pattern. I walked west for several blocks before turning north, then took a zigzag path through residential streets that should have been impossible to predict. The footsteps found me anyway. This time they were closer. David was no longer maintaining his careful half-block distance. He was maybe 30 feet behind me, and when I turned to look, he did not bother to pretend he was doing something else. He just stared at me with an expression I could not read in the dim light. I started walking faster. He matched my pace. I began to jog. He jogged too. When I broke into a run, he ran after me. And for the first time, I realized that this situation might be about to become physically dangerous. I ran toward the brightest lights I could see, which turned out to be a 24-hour gas station about 3 blocks away. I could hear David's footsteps behind me, and they were getting closer. Just as I reached the gas station, he called out my name. "Patricia!" Hearing my name spoken by this stranger in the dark was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. It confirmed that his interest in me was personal and specific, not random. He knew who I was. I burst through the gas station door and told the clerk that someone was following me and I needed to call the police. The clerk, a young man named Kevin, immediately locked the door and called 911 while I tried to catch my breath and watch the parking lot through the window. David did not come into the gas station. Instead, he stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, staring at the building. Then he walked to my car, which was parked on the street, and placed something under the windshield wiper before walking away. The police arrived within 5 minutes. This time, they took the situation much more seriously because David had approached me and because there was evidence of his presence. The item he had left on my car was a handwritten note. I will never forget what it said. "I know you work Tuesday through Saturday, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. I know you live at 2847 NE 23rd Avenue, apartment 3B. I know you buy coffee at the shop on Morrison every Sunday morning at 10:30. I know you call your mother every Wednesday at 7 p.m. I know when you sleep and when you are awake. I am not trying to hurt you. I just want to be close to you. You are the most beautiful part of my day." The note was signed David and included his phone number. Reading those words was like having ice water injected into my veins. This person had been watching me far longer than I realized, and far more closely. He knew details about my life that he could only have learned through extensive surveillance. The reference to calling my mother was particularly disturbing because I made those calls from inside my apartment, which suggested he might have found a way to listen to my conversations. The police arrested David that night and charged him with stalking. In his apartment, they found photographs of me taken with a telephoto lens, copies of my work schedule that he had somehow obtained, and detailed notes about my daily routine. He had been following me for almost 3 months before I noticed him. During the investigation, I learned that David had been fired from his warehouse job 2 weeks before I first spotted him, which meant he had been dedicating his entire nights to stalking me. He had also been following other women in the past, though none of them had reported it to police. David pleaded guilty to stalking charges and was sentenced to 18 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation. He was also ordered to have no contact with me and to stay at least 500 feet away from my home, workplace, and any location where I might reasonably be expected to be. I changed jobs and moved to a different neighborhood. But the experience has left permanent changes in how I think about personal safety. I now understand that being followed is not always obvious, that predators can be patient and methodical, and that trusting my instincts about feeling watched or followed might save my life. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was not the fear I felt during those late-night walks, but the realization of how long David had been watching me without my knowledge. How many other nights had he followed me when I was completely unaware? How many women are being watched right now by someone they have never noticed? I share this story not to frighten people, but to encourage others to trust their instincts and take action when something feels wrong. If you feel like you are being followed, you probably are. Document everything, involve law enforcement early, and do not hesitate to change your routines or ask for help. The feeling that someone is watching you is not paranoia. It is your brain processing subtle cues that your conscious mind might miss. David Chen is still out there somewhere, serving his sentence, and I know that someday he will be released. I hope that prison has given him the help he clearly needed, but I also know that stalkers often repeat their behaviors. I live differently now, more carefully, but I refuse to let fear control my life entirely. Every woman deserves to walk home safely at night. Every person deserves to live without being hunted by strangers who have turned them into objects of obsession. If my story prevents even one person from going through what I experienced, then sharing these painful details will have been worth it. My name is Michael, and I am a college student in Detroit. I thought I knew the city well enough to walk anywhere, even at night. Growing up in the suburbs of Wayne County, I had always heard stories about dangerous parts of the city. But after 3 years studying at Wayne State University, I believed I had developed good street sense. I knew which areas to avoid, which routes were well lit and populated, and how to carry myself with confidence to avoid looking like an easy target. What happened to me 6 months ago taught me that even familiar cities can become foreign territories when technology fails and pride overrides common sense. I was in my junior year, majoring in mechanical engineering, and had developed a routine of staying late at the library during finals week. The engineering building had study rooms that stayed open 24 hours, and I preferred working there because my apartment had too many distractions. My roommates were not exactly focused on academics, and the noise from their gaming sessions and movie marathons made it impossible to concentrate on thermodynamics or fluid mechanics. On the night in question, it was mid-December, and Detroit was experiencing one of those brutal cold snaps that make you question why anyone ever decided to build a city in this location. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, with a wind chill that made it feel like it was below zero. I had been studying since 6 in the evening, working through problem sets for my heat transfer course. And by the time I looked up from my textbooks, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The library was almost empty, except for a few other students who looked as exhausted as I felt. I packed up my engineering notebooks, calculator, and the stack of reference books I had been consulting, and headed for the exit. The plan was simple. Walk the 12 blocks to my apartment on Cass Avenue, take a hot shower, grab a few hours of sleep, and then return to studying after my morning classes. I had walked this route dozens of times, both during the day and at night. It was a straightforward path that took me through the heart of the University District, past several dormitories, a few late-night food places that catered to students, and through neighborhoods that, while not affluent, were generally safe due to the constant presence of university security patrols and students walking to and from campus. The cold hit me like a physical blow when I stepped outside. December in Detroit is not forgiving. And I had dressed for sitting in a heated library, not for a 20-minute walk through Arctic conditions. I was wearing jeans, a sweater, and a jacket that was adequate for short distances, but not sufficient for extended exposure to this kind of weather. I pulled my knit cap down over my ears and started walking quickly, hoping to generate enough body heat to stay comfortable. Everything was normal for the first few blocks. I passed the dormitory, where most of the freshmen lived, and I could see lights in windows where other students were either studying or socializing despite the late hour. The sidewalks were clear of snow but slick with ice, so I had to pay attention to where I was stepping. The street lights created pools of orange illumination that provided enough visibility to navigate safely. My phone was in my jacket pocket, and about halfway through my walk, I felt it buzz with what I assumed was a text message. I pulled it out to check, thinking it might be one of my roommates asking when I would be home. But instead of displaying a message, the screen showed a low battery warning and then went completely black. This was annoying but not catastrophic. I knew my route well enough that I did not need GPS, and I was only about 6 blocks from home. I put the dead phone back in my pocket and continued walking, focusing on keeping warm and maintaining my footing on the icy sidewalk. That is when I made the decision that nearly cost me my life. As I approached the intersection where I normally turned left toward my apartment building, I noticed that the street was blocked by construction barriers. There were orange cones and yellow tape indicating that some kind of road work was in progress, though no workers were present at this hour. The barriers completely blocked the sidewalk and forced pedestrians to cross to the other side of the street or find an alternate route. Under normal circumstances, I would have simply walked around the construction zone, adding maybe 5 minutes to my trip. But the cold was becoming unbearable, and I was starting to lose feeling in my fingers despite keeping them in my pockets. I was also exhausted from hours of studying and not thinking as clearly as I should have been. I decided to take what I thought would be a shortcut through a neighborhood I'd seen from the bus but never walked through. It was an area of older industrial buildings and warehouses that had been converted to lofts and artist studios. From what I could observe during daylight bus rides, it seemed like a trendy area where young professionals and creative types were moving as part of Detroit's urban renewal efforts. I turned right instead of left and walked 2 blocks east, then turned north on a street I had never been on before. The plan was to walk parallel to my normal route for a few blocks, then turn west and reconnect with familiar territory. It seemed logical, and I estimated it would add no more than 10 minutes to my trip. The first sign that I'd made a serious error became apparent within 3 blocks of leaving my normal route. The character of the neighborhood changed dramatically. Instead of converted lofts with trendy coffee shops and galleries on the ground floor, I was walking past buildings that were clearly abandoned. Many of the streetlights were broken, creating long stretches of darkness between the few that were still functioning. The cold was becoming a serious problem. My hands were numb, and I was starting to shiver uncontrollably. I needed to get indoors soon, but I also needed to figure out where I was and how to get back to familiar territory. Without my phone, I had no way to access maps or call for help. I continued walking north, assuming that I would eventually reach a major street that I recognized. But after another 4 blocks, the situation became worse rather than better. The buildings around me were not just abandoned. They were derelict. Windows were boarded up or broken out entirely. Graffiti covered most surfaces, and not the artistic kind you might see in gentrified areas, but the territorial markings that indicate gang activity. The streetlights became increasingly sporadic, and I realized I was walking through sections where entire blocks had no illumination at all. The only light came from the occasional security light on a building that was still occupied, and even those were few and far between. I was now genuinely lost and starting to panic. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was becoming dangerous. I could feel my body temperature dropping, and my thinking was becoming sluggish. I knew I needed to find shelter and warmth, but I also knew I was in an area where approaching the wrong building or the wrong people could create problems far worse than hypothermia. I decided to turn west, hoping to walk back toward the university district. But the street I chose led me deeper into the industrial wasteland. I was now walking between massive abandoned factory buildings that blocked out what little ambient light came from the city. The silence was complete except for the sound of my footsteps echoing off concrete walls and the distant hum of highway traffic. After another 10 minutes of walking, I realized I was completely disoriented. The streets in this area did not follow the grid pattern I was familiar with from the university district. They curved and dead-ended in ways that made no sense, probably following the original industrial layout from decades ago when this area was active manufacturing. I was beginning to experience the early stages of hypothermia. My shivering had become violent and uncontrollable, and I was having trouble concentrating on navigation. I knew I needed to find shelter immediately, even if it meant breaking into an abandoned building. That is when I saw the light. About 2 blocks ahead, I could see illumination coming from what appeared to be a large building. As I got closer, I could make out that it was some kind of warehouse or factory that was still in operation. There were vehicles in a fenced parking area, and I could hear the sound of machinery running inside. I approached the building with relief, thinking I could ask for help or at least warm up for a few minutes while I figured out how to get home. The building had loading docks and what appeared to be a night shift working inside. I could see people moving around through windows that were not covered. I walked up to what looked like the main entrance and knocked on the door. After a few minutes, a man opened it. He was in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a suspicious expression. Behind him, I could see several other men who had stopped what they were doing to look at me. I explained that I was lost and cold, and asked if I could use a phone to call someone to pick me up. The man looked me up and down, taking in my university sweatshirt, my backpack full of textbooks, and my obvious distress from the cold. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. "This is private property." I apologized and explained that I was just trying to find my way back to the university area. But the man's expression became more hostile rather than sympathetic. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, cutting off my view of the interior. "Listen, college boy," he said. You need to leave right now and not come back. You did not see anything here, and we did not see you. Understand?" I was confused by his reaction, but I was also too cold and disoriented to argue. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he grabbed my arm. "Which way did you come from?" he asked. I pointed in the direction I had been walking from, and he shook his head. "Do not go back that way. Walk south for 4 blocks, then west until you hit Woodward Avenue. Follow Woodward north back to campus. Do not stop, do not talk to anyone, and do not come back here." He went back inside and locked the door, leaving me standing in the cold with more questions than answers. But I was in no position to investigate further. I followed his directions and started walking south. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The cold was now beyond uncomfortable. It was genuinely life-threatening. I was stumbling frequently, and my thinking had become so impaired that I had trouble remembering the directions I had been given. I knew I was experiencing moderate hypothermia and that I needed to get warm soon or risk serious medical consequences. The area I was walking through seemed to get worse rather than better. The abandoned buildings gave way to empty lots filled with debris and stripped cars. I passed several structures that were clearly being used as homeless encampments, and I could smell fires burning inside despite the danger this posed in buildings without proper ventilation or fire safety systems. I encountered my first group of people about 3 blocks south of the warehouse. 3 men were standing around a barrel with a fire burning inside, trying to stay warm. They watched me approach with interest, and one of them called out to me, "Hey, college boy, you lost?" I kept walking without responding, following the advice I had received about not stopping or talking to anyone. But they were not content to let me pass. "Hey, I am talking to you," the same man said, and I could hear footsteps following me. I started walking faster, but my coordination was impaired by the cold, and I was not moving as quickly as I needed to. The footsteps behind me increased in pace, and I realized I was about to be confronted by people who might not have my best interests in mind. "Stop right there," one of them said, and I could hear that they were close behind me now. I turned around to face them, hoping that direct eye contact and a calm demeanor would de-escalate the situation. There were 3 of them, all men in their 20s or 30s, dressed in heavy coats and boots suitable for the weather. They did not look like they were homeless. They looked like they lived in this area and considered me an intruder. "What are you doing here?" the apparent leader asked. He was a tall man with a beard and a scar across his left cheek. "This is not tourist territory." I explained that I was lost and trying to get back to Wayne State, but this seemed to amuse rather than satisfy them. "Wayne State," one of the others repeated. "You hear that? College boy thinks he can just walk through here like he owns the place." I assured them I meant no disrespect and was just trying to get home, but the situation was clearly escalating in a direction I did not like. The leader stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell alcohol on his breath. "See, here is the thing," he said. "This is our neighborhood. People do not just wander through here without paying a toll. You understand what I'm saying?" I did not have much money with me, maybe $20 in cash, but I was prepared to give them whatever I had if it would allow me to continue safely. I reached for my wallet, but the leader grabbed my wrist. "Not so fast," he said. "First, we need to know what you were doing at Rodriguez's place." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I realized they must have seen me at the warehouse. I explained that I had just asked for directions because I was lost, but this seemed to make them more suspicious rather than less. "Nobody just asks Rodriguez for directions," the bearded man said. "That is not how this works. You either have business there or you are some kind of cop." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and I was beginning to realize that these men might represent a serious threat to my safety. They were clearly associated with whatever operation was running out of that warehouse, and they suspected I was either law enforcement or some kind of rival. I tried to back away, but there were 3 of them, and they had positioned themselves to block my escape routes. The cold was still sapping my strength and impairing my judgment, but adrenaline was beginning to counteract some of the effects of hypothermia. "Look," I said, "I do not know anything about any Rodriguez or what goes on in that warehouse. I am just a student trying to get home. I got lost because of construction on my normal route and my phone died. I am not a cop. I am not a rival. I am nobody. Important." The leader studied my face for a long moment, then looked at my backpack and the engineering textbooks visible through the partially open zipper. "Show me your student ID," he said. I fumbled through my wallet with numb fingers and produced my Wayne State identification card. He examined it carefully, comparing the photo to my face, then handed it back. "You are telling the truth about being a student," he said. "But that does not change the fact that you saw something you were not supposed to see, and you are in a place you are not supposed to be." One of the other men whispered something to the leader that I could not hear, and his expression became more serious. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. "You are going to give us that $20 you were reaching for, and then you are going to walk straight south for 6 blocks without looking back. When you get to the main road, you are going to turn west and not stop until you reach civilization. And you are never going to come back to this area, and you are never going to tell anyone what you saw tonight. If you do, we will find you. Wayne State is not that big, and we know people who know people, understand?" I nodded and handed over the money. $20 was a small price to pay for safe passage out of this situation. The leader pocketed the cash and stepped aside. "Remember what I said about not looking back," he warned. "We are going to watch you until you are out of our territory. And if you do anything stupid like try to circle back or call the cops from the first phone you find, there will be consequences." I walked away as quickly as my frozen legs would carry me, fighting the urge to run because I knew that would make me look guilty of something. I could feel their eyes on me for several blocks, but I did not turn around to check. The 6 blocks to the main road felt like 6 miles. I was now seriously hypothermic and having trouble maintaining my balance. My hands and feet were completely numb, and I was beginning to experience the confused thinking and poor coordination that indicates severe heat loss. When I finally reached Woodward Avenue, the sight of normal city traffic and functioning streetlights was like emerging from a nightmare into reality. I was still several miles from campus, but I was back in civilization where I could flag down a taxi or call for help from a business that was still open. I managed to find a gas station with a payphone and called my roommate to pick me up. While I waited for him to arrive, I sat in the heated convenience store and tried to warm up while the clerk kept a concerned eye on me. When my roommate arrived and saw my condition, he wanted to take me to the emergency room, but I convinced him I would be okay with warm clothes and hot drinks. We went home, where I spent the next hour in a hot shower trying to restore circulation to my extremities. I never reported what happened that night to the police, was not entirely sure what I had witnessed, and the threats I had received made it clear that getting involved with law enforcement could create more problems than it would solve. But I learned several important lessons that night about personal safety and urban navigation. First, never walk alone in an unfamiliar area, especially at night, and especially in a city like Detroit, where the character of neighborhoods can change dramatically within a few blocks. Second, always carry backup power for your phone and let someone know your planned route and expected arrival time. Third, trust your instincts about dangerous situations and do not let pride or stubbornness override common sense. Most importantly, I learned that even cities you think you know can harbor areas that operate by completely different rules than the rest of society. What I stumbled into that night was clearly some kind of organized criminal operation, and my presence there was interpreted as a threat that needed to be neutralized. I still live in Detroit and still attend Wayne State, but I have never again deviated from well-traveled routes. And I never walk alone at night without telling someone where I am going and when I expect to arrive. The $20 I lost that night was the cheapest education I ever received about the reality of urban life and the importance of situational awareness. That experience taught me that there are places in every city where the normal social contract does not apply, and stumbling into them accidentally can have serious consequences. I was lucky that the people I encountered were more interested in protecting their operation than in harming a random college student. But the outcome could have been very different. I share this story as a reminder that technology failures can quickly turn routine activities into dangerous situations, and that pride and overconfidence can lead to poor decisions that put you at risk. Always have a backup plan. Always let someone know where you're going. And always trust your instincts when a situation feels wrong. My name is Linda, and I have always believed in the kindness of strangers. That belief almost cost me everything. Growing up in a small town outside Phoenix, I was raised to trust people and to accept help when it was offered. My parents taught me that most people are fundamentally good, and that acts of kindness between strangers are what makes society function. This worldview served me well for 28 years, until one night when my faith in human nature was nearly fatal. I work as a nurse at Phoenix General Hospital, and I had just finished a double shift that ended at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in September. I was exhausted and looking forward to getting home to my apartment in Tempe, taking a hot bath, and sleeping for 10 hours straight. I had been on my feet for 16 hours, dealing with a particularly difficult day in the emergency department, where we had multiple trauma cases and several patients who required intensive monitoring. My car was parked in the hospital's employee garage, and everything seemed normal as I walked to it. The garage was well lit and secured, and I had never experienced any problems there before. I got into my car, started the engine, and began the 20-minute drive home through suburban Phoenix. The route from the hospital to my apartment is mostly surface streets through residential neighborhoods. I preferred this route over the highway because it was more direct and usually had less traffic at night. The streets are well maintained and adequately lit, passing through areas that are generally considered safe and family-oriented. I was about 10 minutes into my drive when I noticed the engine making an unusual sound. It was a grinding noise that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the front wheels, accompanied by a vibration I could feel through the steering wheel. I had never heard this sound before, and it was getting progressively worse. Within another mile, the car began to lose power. The engine was still running, but when I pressed the accelerator, the response was sluggish and accompanied by more grinding noises. I could see steam starting to rise from under the hood, and I realized I was experiencing some kind of mechanical failure that was going to leave me stranded. I managed to pull over to the side of the road in a residential area where I felt relatively safe. The houses around me were well maintained, with porch lights on and cars in the driveways, indicating that this was an active neighborhood where people were probably still awake despite the late hour. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, trying to decide what to do. My cell phone had good signal strength, so I could have called for roadside assistance or asked someone to pick me up. But I was tired and frustrated, and I thought I might be able to identify the problem myself. My father had taught me basic car maintenance, and I had dealt with minor mechanical issues before. I got out of the car and opened the hood. Immediately, I could see that one of the radiator hoses had burst, and coolant was leaking onto the engine block, creating the steam I had observed. This was clearly not something I could fix on the side of the road, and the car was not safe to drive in this condition. I was standing there looking at the engine and trying to decide whether to call a tow truck or ask a friend to pick me up when a car pulled over behind me. It was a newer model sedan, dark blue or black, very clean and well maintained. The driver got out and approached me with a concerned expression. "Having car trouble?" he asked. The man appeared to be in his 40s, well dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, with short gray hair and a friendly demeanor. He looked like someone who might be a teacher or an office manager, the kind of person you would trust to help your elderly parents or watch your house while you were on vacation. There was nothing threatening or unusual about his appearance or manner. "Yes," I replied. "I think my radiator hose burst. The car is not drivable." He walked over to look at the engine, and his assessment confirmed mine. "That is definitely a burst hose," he said. "You are not going anywhere in this car tonight. Do you have someone you can call to pick you up?" I explained that I did have people I could call, but I felt bad about waking them up at this hour, especially since I lived 20 minutes away, and it would be a significant inconvenience for them to drive across town to get me. "I would be happy to give you a ride," the man offered. "I am heading in that direction anyway, and it is no trouble at all." I hesitated for a moment. I had been taught never to get into a car with a stranger, but this man seemed genuinely helpful, and I was tired enough that the prospect of getting home quickly was very appealing. The neighborhood felt safe, and he had stopped to help rather than seeking me out, which suggested his intentions were good. "That is very kind of you," I said. "Are you sure it is not out of your way?" "Not at all," he replied. "I live in Scottsdale, so I will be driving right through Tempe. It would be my pleasure to help." I gathered my purse and nursing bag from my car, locked it, and accepted his offer. He opened the passenger door for me in a gesture that seemed polite rather than calculated, and I got into his car. The interior was immaculate, with leather seats and the smell of a new car air freshener. Classical music was playing softly from the stereo, and there were no personal items visible anywhere in the car. It felt more like a rental car than someone's personal vehicle, which I found slightly odd, but not alarming. "I am Linda," I said as he got back into the driver's seat. "Nice to meet you, Linda. I am David," he replied. "What do you do for work?" I told him I was a nurse at Phoenix General, and he seemed impressed and interested. He asked questions about my job that seemed genuine and appropriate, and he shared that he worked in insurance and was familiar with the hospital because his company processed claims for medical facilities. The conversation felt natural and pleasant as we drove through the residential neighborhoods toward my apartment. David was knowledgeable about the area and made comments about local restaurants and businesses that suggested he really was familiar with the route we were taking. About 5 minutes into the drive, I noticed we were taking a slightly different route than I would have chosen. But Phoenix has many ways to get from one place to another, and I assumed he was taking streets he was more familiar with. When I mentioned that he could turn left at the next light to get to my street more directly, he said he preferred to avoid that intersection because of construction. It was not until we had been driving for 10 minutes that I began to feel uneasy. We were now in an area I did not recognize, and when I asked about it, David said he was taking a route that would avoid traffic, even though there was no traffic at this hour on a Tuesday night. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite my growing concern. "Do not worry," David said. "I know a shortcut that will get you home faster." But the streets we were on were definitely not leading toward my apartment. I could see signs for areas that were in the opposite direction from where I lived. And I realized that David was either lost or deliberately taking me somewhere I did not want to go. "I think we made a wrong turn somewhere," I said. "My apartment is in the other direction." "No, this is right," David said. And there was something different about his tone now. It was less friendly and more assertive, and he did not look at me when he spoke. I reached for my cell phone to check our location on GPS, but David noticed the movement and reacted quickly. "Put the phone down," he said, and now his voice was completely different. There was no trace of the helpful stranger who had stopped to assist me with my car trouble. I looked at him more carefully and realized that his appearance had changed subtly. His posture was more tense, his expression was harder, and he was gripping the steering wheel in a way that suggested he was prepared for me to try something. "I want to get out," I said. "Please stop the car and let me out." "That is not going to happen," David replied. "We are going to take a little drive, and you are going to sit quietly and not cause any problems." I reached for the door handle, but heard the click of the automatic locks engaging. I was now trapped in the car with someone who had revealed himself to be something very different from the Good Samaritan who had offered to help me. My nursing training had included some basic instruction about personal safety and crisis situations, and I knew that my chances of survival decreased significantly if David succeeded in taking me to whatever destination he had in mind. I needed to escape from the car while we were still in a populated area where I might be able to get help. I started looking for opportunities to jump from the vehicle. We were driving through an area with shopping centers and restaurants, some of which were still open despite the late hour. If I could get out of the car near other people, I might be able to get help before David could recapture me. David seemed to sense my intentions and began driving more aggressively, accelerating through intersections and making turns that would make it difficult for me to safely exit the vehicle. But he also had to obey traffic laws to avoid attracting attention from police, which meant he had to slow down for red lights and stop signs. As we approached a major intersection with a gas station and a 24-hour diner, I saw my opportunity. David had to stop for a red light, and there were other cars around us, along with people visible outside the businesses. I reached for the door handle again, hoping the locks had disengaged when we stopped, but they had not. David noticed my movement and grabbed my wrist with his free hand. "Do not even think about it," he said. "If you try to run, I will catch you, and then things will get much worse for you." But I could see people outside the diner, and I knew this might be my only chance to escape before David took me somewhere isolated where no one would hear me scream. I started hitting the window with my fist and shouting for help, hoping someone would notice. David released my wrist and reached across me to grab something from the glove compartment. I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a knife or some other kind of weapon, and I knew I had to act immediately. As the light turned green and David began to accelerate, I grabbed the steering wheel and yanked it hard to the right, causing the car to swerve toward the curb. David fought me for control of the vehicle, and we both struggled as the car lurched across the intersection. The car jumped the curb and scraped along a concrete barrier before David regained control and steered back onto the road. But the incident had slowed us down enough that I was able to reach the door lock mechanism and unlock my door. As David accelerated again, trying to get away from the intersection where our struggle might have been observed, I opened the door and threw myself out of the moving vehicle. I hit the asphalt hard and rolled several times before coming to rest on the shoulder of the road. I was scraped and bruised, and my left shoulder felt like it might be dislocated. But I was alive and free from the car. David did not stop to try to recapture me. He accelerated away and disappeared into traffic, leaving me lying on the side of the road with injuries that required medical attention, but were not life-threatening. Several people had witnessed my escape from the car, and someone had already called 911 by the time I was able to sit up and assess my condition. An ambulance arrived within minutes, followed by police officers who took my statement about what had happened. The investigation revealed that David was not his real name, and the car he had been driving was reported stolen earlier that day from a rental car company. The license plate number I was able to provide led police to security camera footage that showed him switching plates in a parking lot. But they were never able to identify him or locate him. The detective assigned to my case told me that my experience matched a pattern of similar incidents in the Phoenix area over the previous 6 months. Several women had reported being approached by a well-dressed, friendly man who offered assistance with car trouble or other problems, then attempted to abduct them. I was the first victim who had managed to escape and provide a detailed description of both the perpetrator and his methods. I spent one night in the hospital for observation and treatment of my injuries, which included road rash, bruised ribs, and a separated shoulder. But I was lucky to be alive, and I knew it. If I had not acted when I did, David would have taken me somewhere isolated where the outcome would have been very different. The experience has fundamentally changed how I think about accepting help from strangers. I still believe that most people are fundamentally good, but I also understand that predators deliberately exploit our trust and kindness to gain access to victims. I share this story as a warning to others, especially women, about the tactics used by people who prey on those in vulnerable situations. Car trouble, a dead cell phone battery, being lost in an unfamiliar area. These are all situations where we might be tempted to accept help from someone who appears friendly and trustworthy. The most important lesson I learned is that it is always better to call for help from someone you know, even if it is inconvenient for them, rather than accepting assistance from a stranger. If you must accept help from someone you do not know, do it in a public place where other people can observe the interaction and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. David presented himself as exactly the kind of person you would want to encounter in a crisis. Helpful, competent, and trustworthy. But predators are skilled at creating false personas that appeal to our desire to believe in human kindness. The fact that someone appears normal and helpful does not mean they are safe. I was fortunate to escape with my life and relatively minor injuries. But I know that other women who encountered this same predator may not have been as lucky. The police investigation is still active, and I hope that my testimony will eventually help bring this person to justice and prevent him from harming others. My name is James, and I used to be a complete skeptic about paranormal activity. Walking past the old Brennan house changed that forever. I am a structural engineer who believes in logical explanations, scientific method, and rational thought. I have always found stories about ghosts and hauntings to be nonsense believed by people who lack critical thinking skills. What happened to me on a foggy October night in Charleston has challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. I moved to Charleston 3 years ago for a job with a historic preservation firm. The city's combination of centuries-old architecture and modern engineering challenges appealed to me, and I found an apartment in the French Quarter within walking distance of both my office and the best restaurants downtown. Charleston is a city built for walking, especially in the evening when the temperature drops and the humidity becomes bearable. I developed a routine of taking long walks after work, exploring different neighborhoods, and studying the architectural details that have allowed these buildings to survive for centuries. The historic district is particularly fascinating. With its antebellum mansions, cobblestone streets, and carefully preserved structures that tell the story of 300 years of American history. The Brennan House sits on a corner lot on Lagar Street, surrounded by an elaborate wrought iron fence that has been painted black so many times, the original decorative details are nearly obscured. The house itself is a 3-story Georgian mansion built in 1847, with tall windows, ornate columns, and a wraparound porch that speaks of Southern wealth and elegance from before the Civil War. What makes the Brennan House different from other historic mansions in the area is that it has been abandoned for almost 20 years. The windows are boarded up, the paint is peeling, and the once manicured gardens have grown wild with neglect. According to local stories, the house has been haunted since the 1920s, when the last member of the Brennan family died under mysterious circumstances. I had walked past the house dozens of times during my evening strolls, always dismissing the local ghost stories as tourist attractions designed to separate visitors from their money. Charleston has built an entire industry around its supposed supernatural history, with ghost tours running every night and guidebooks full of stories about restless spirits and unexplained phenomena. The night that changed my perspective was October 15th, a Tuesday evening when Charleston was experiencing an unusual weather pattern that had brought dense fog in from the harbor. The fog was so thick that streetlights created only small pools of visibility, and the historic district took on an otherworldly atmosphere that made even familiar streets feel strange and disorienting. I had finished dinner at a restaurant on King Street and decided to walk home despite the poor visibility. I enjoy the challenge of navigating by memory and landmarks, and I thought the fog added an interesting element to my usual route through the historic neighborhoods. As I approached the intersection where the Brennan House sits, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. One of the third-floor windows, which I knew had been boarded up for years, was showing light. Not electric light, but the warm, flickering glow of candles or oil lamps. I stood at the corner for several minutes, staring at the window and trying to think of logical explanations. Perhaps the boarding had fallen away from the inside, allowing light from a street lamp to shine through. Or maybe homeless people had broken into the house and were using candles for illumination. As I watched, a shadow moved across the lighted window. It was clearly the silhouette of a person, and from the size and movement, it appeared to be a woman in a long dress. She moved slowly from one side of the window to the other, paused for a moment as if looking out, then disappeared from view. My engineering mind immediately began analyzing what I had observed. The movement was too deliberate and purposeful to be caused by something inanimate like curtains or debris. Someone was definitely inside the house, despite the fact that it had been legally condemned and was supposed to be secured against entry. I decided to investigate. The property was surrounded by the wrought iron fence, but I could see that some of the fence pickets had been bent or broken, creating gaps large enough for a person to squeeze through. I found one of these gaps and managed to enter the property without difficulty. The yard was overgrown with vegetation that had been allowed to grow wild for years, creating a jungle of vines, bushes, and small trees that made navigation treacherous in the fog. As I approached the house, I could see that several of the first-floor windows had been broken, and the boarding on some of them had been pried away, creating access points. The front porch was littered with debris, and the steps leading to the main entrance were partially collapsed. I circled the house looking for signs of recent entry, and I found evidence that people had been using the property. There were empty bottles, food containers, and other trash that suggested homeless individuals or vandals had been accessing the building regularly. But what I could not find was any sign of current occupation. There were no vehicles parked nearby, no sounds coming from inside the house, and no additional lights visible from any of the windows. The third-floor window that had been illuminated when I first observed it was now dark. I stood in the overgrown yard for about 10 minutes, watching and listening for any indication that someone was inside the house. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction, and the only sounds were distant traffic and the occasional foghorn from the harbor. I was about to leave when the light appeared again, this time in a different window on the second floor. The same warm, flickering glow, and the same shadowy figure moving slowly past the window. But this was impossible. I had been watching the house continuously, and no one had entered or left the building during the time I had been there. I moved closer to get a better view, but as I approached the second-floor window, the light disappeared again. I waited for several more minutes, but it did not return. The house was completely dark and silent. I left the property feeling confused and unsettled. There had to be a logical explanation for what I had observed, but I could not think of one that accounted for all the facts. Someone was inside the house, but they seemed to have the ability to move from floor to floor without making any noise and to appear and disappear at will. Over the next week, I found myself thinking about the Brennan house constantly. I researched the property's history and learned about the tragic events that had supposedly led to its haunted reputation. I also discovered that other people had reported similar experiences over the years, seeing lights and figures in the windows of the supposedly empty house. The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week later, I decided to return to the house during my evening walk. This time, the weather was clear, and visibility was excellent. I wanted to observe the property under normal conditions and see if I could spot any signs of habitation that I had missed during the foggy night. I approached the house from the same direction, and everything appeared exactly as it had the previous week. The windows were boarded up, the yard was overgrown, and there were no signs of recent activity. I walked around the perimeter of the property, examining the fence and looking for evidence of entry or occupancy. As I completed my circuit and prepared to continue my walk home, I glanced up at the third-floor windows one more time. The same window that had been illuminated during my previous visit was showing light again. The same warm, flickering glow, and the same female figure moving slowly across the frame. But this time, something was different. The figure stopped moving and seemed to be looking directly at me. For several seconds, we stared at each other across the distance between the sidewalk and the third-floor window. Then the figure raised what appeared to be her hand and pointed directly at me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. This was not random movement or the play of shadows and light. Someone or something in that window was acknowledging my presence and responding to my observation. I decided to test my theory. I moved to a different position on the sidewalk, and the figure in the window turned to follow my movement. When I stepped behind a tree to break the line of sight, the figure moved to a different window to maintain visual contact with me. This continued for several minutes, with the figure tracking my movements and maintaining what appeared to be deliberate observation of my position. Finally, I waved at the window, and the figure waved back before disappearing completely. I stood on the sidewalk for another 20 minutes, but the light did not return, and I saw no further signs of activity in the house. I left feeling more confused than ever about what I had experienced. The third encounter occurred 2 weeks later, and it was the most disturbing. I had not planned to visit the Brennan house, but I was walking home from a late dinner when my route took me past the property. It was almost midnight, and the historic district was nearly deserted. As I approached the intersection, I saw something that made no sense. The house was completely illuminated, with warm light glowing from every window on all 3 floors. It looked exactly as it might have appeared in the 1800s, when it was occupied by a wealthy family hosting an evening social event. Through the windows, I could see people moving around inside the house. Men in formal evening wear, and women in elaborate gowns that suggested a social gathering from a century ago. I could hear music playing, the sound of conversation and laughter, and the general ambiance of a successful party. I approached the fence and saw that the yard was no longer overgrown. The gardens appeared to be perfectly maintained, with manicured lawns, pruned bushes, and flowers blooming despite the fact that it was late October. The house itself looked newly painted and maintained, with no signs of the decay and neglect I had observed during my previous visits. I stood at the fence for almost an hour, watching this impossible scene and trying to understand what I was experiencing. The people inside the house seemed to be from a different era, dressed and behaving as if they were attending a formal social event from the 1800s. As I watched, one of the women approached a window and looked out directly at me. She was young and beautiful, dressed in an elaborate blue gown that sparkled in the light. She smiled and gestured for me to come closer, and I found myself walking toward the gate without consciously deciding to do so. But as I reached for the gate handle, everything changed. The lights disappeared, the music stopped, and the house returned to its familiar state of abandonment and decay. The yard was overgrown again, the windows were boarded up, and there was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. I have never been able to explain what I experienced at the Brennan house. I have researched the property extensively and learned that similar reports have been made for almost a century, always describing the same phenomena: lights in the windows, figures moving inside, and the occasional appearance of a fully restored and occupied house. I still consider myself a rational person who believes in scientific explanations for natural phenomena. But I also know what I saw, and I cannot dismiss it as imagination or misperception. The Brennan house exists in some state that defies conventional understanding, and I was privileged to witness something that most people would consider impossible. I no longer walk past the house during my evening strolls, not because I am afraid, but because I understand that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some boundaries between past and present are not meant to be crossed by casual observers. My name is John, and I work security for downtown office buildings. I thought I had seen everything the city had to offer during night hours. After 12 years of walking empty corridors, checking locked doors, and dealing with the occasional drunk trying to find shelter in our building lobbies, I believed I understood the rhythm of Minneapolis after midnight. What happened to me last winter during one of the coldest stretches on record taught me that some things move through our city that have never been cataloged by animal control or explained by urban wildlife experts. I work for Midwest Security Services, a company that contracts with several major office buildings in the downtown core. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and my route includes 3 buildings connected by skyway tunnels that allow me to move between them without going outside. This is particularly important during Minnesota winters, when the temperature can hit 20 below and the wind makes it feel like 40 below zero. The buildings I patrol are typical downtown office towers built in the 1980s and 1990s, housing insurance companies, law firms, and accounting practices. During the day, they buzz with activity, but at night they become vast, empty spaces where my footsteps echo in corridors designed to hold hundreds of people. Most nights, the only sounds are the hum of HVAC systems, the occasional ding of elevator bells, and the distant rumble of snow plows clearing the streets outside. My routine is methodical and precise. I make rounds every 2 hours, checking each floor of each building, ensuring the doors are locked, alarm systems are functioning, and no unauthorized persons have gained entry. I carry a flashlight, a two-way radio, and a key card that gives me access to every area of the buildings. I also carry a logbook where I record the time and location of each security check. The incidents began during the second week of January, when Minneapolis was experiencing a polar vortex that had pushed temperatures to 30 below zero. The city becomes eerily quiet during these extreme cold events, as most people stay indoors and even vehicular traffic drops to essential services only. My buildings felt more isolated than usual, surrounded by empty streets and sidewalks that no sane person would attempt to navigate. I was making my 2 a.m. rounds through the first building when I heard something unusual coming from the basement level. It was a scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, like claws or fingernails dragging across concrete. I assumed it was related to the building's heating system, which had been working overtime to maintain comfortable temperatures against the extreme cold outside. But as I descended to the basement to investigate, the scratching stopped. I checked the mechanical rooms, storage areas, and utility spaces, but found nothing unusual. The heating system was functioning normally, and there were no signs of animals or unauthorized entry. I noted the incident in my logbook and continued my rounds. 3 nights later, I heard the scratching again, this time from a different location in the basement. It seemed to be coming from the area near the loading dock, where delivery trucks would normally park during business hours. Again, when I went to investigate, the sound stopped before I could locate its source. I began to pay more attention to the basement areas during my rounds, and I started noticing other unusual signs. There were wet footprints on the concrete floor that appeared and disappeared between my visits, despite the fact that the basement should have been completely dry and no one else had access to the building. The footprints were not human. They were larger, with what appeared to be claw marks at the end of each toe. I reported these observations to my supervisor, but he suggested they were probably caused by melting ice from my boots or condensation from the heating system. He reminded me that extreme cold can cause buildings to behave in unusual ways, with pipes expanding and contracting and heating systems working at maximum capacity. I accepted his explanation, but I also started carrying a camera to document anything unusual I encountered. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong occurred during my 4 a.m. round on January 20th. I was walking through the skyway tunnel that connects the first and second buildings when I heard movement in the ceiling space above me. It sounded like something large moving through the ventilation system, but it was moving too deliberately and purposefully to be random settling or expansion of the ductwork. I stopped walking and listened carefully. The movement continued, following a path that seemed to parallel my route through the tunnel. When I started walking again, the movement resumed. When I stopped, it stopped too. Something was tracking my progress through the building, staying hidden in the spaces between floors and walls. I used my radio to call my supervisor, but the signal was weak in the tunnel, and I could not establish clear communication. I decided to complete my rounds and file a comprehensive report when I returned to the security office in the first building. As I entered the second building, the movement in the ceiling stopped, but I could hear it resuming in the walls. It was definitely following me, staying just out of sight but maintaining awareness of my location. I began to feel genuinely concerned about my safety. though I could not have explained exactly what I was afraid of. I completed my check of the second building without any direct encounters, but I could hear movement throughout the building that suggested I was not alone. The sounds came from utility spaces, elevator shafts, and areas between floors that should have been inaccessible to anything larger than a rat. When I returned to the first building through the Skyway tunnel, I was prepared for the movement to resume in the ceiling above me. But this time, something different happened. About halfway through the tunnel, one of the ceiling panels shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something looking down at me through the gap. I could not see it clearly in the dim lighting of the tunnel, but I could make out eyes that reflected the emergency lighting like an animal's eyes would. They were larger than human eyes, and they were definitely watching me with what appeared to be intelligent attention. I stopped walking and shined my flashlight up at the ceiling. But the panel had already shifted back into place, and there was no sign of whatever had been observing me. I stood in the tunnel for several minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate movement above me, but everything was silent. I decided to cut my rounds short and return to the security office to call for backup. But as I walked toward the first building, I realized that the thing in the ceiling was following me again. I could hear it moving through the ventilation system, staying parallel to my path, but remaining hidden from view. When I reached the security office, I immediately called my supervisor and requested that someone come to the building to assist me. I explained what I had observed and heard, but my supervisor was skeptical about my report. He suggested that stress and isolation during the night shift can cause people to misinterpret normal building sounds as something more threatening, but he agreed to send someone to check on me, and within 30 minutes, my colleague Marcus arrived to help complete the remaining rounds. I briefed him on what I had experienced, and he agreed to help me investigate the areas where I had heard the unusual sounds. We started in the basement, where the scratching sounds had originated. Marcus was armed with a more powerful flashlight and a camera with a flash, and we systematically checked every area that could potentially hide an animal or intruder. We found more of the wet footprints, and Marcus agreed that they did not look human. We also found scratch marks on some of the concrete walls that appeared to be fresh. They were too deep and too high to have been made by any known urban wildlife, and they seemed to have been made by claws rather than tools. As we moved through the building, we continued to hear movement in the walls and ceiling spaces. Marcus acknowledged that the sounds were unusual, but he maintained that they were probably caused by the building's structure responding to the extreme cold outside. It was not until we reached the Skyway tunnel that Marcus became convinced that we were dealing with something beyond normal building maintenance issues. As we walked through the tunnel, the ceiling panel that had shifted during my earlier encounter moved again, and this time, Marcus saw what I had seen. The eyes that looked down at us were definitely not human, and they belonged to something much larger than any animal that should have been able to access the building's ventilation system. Marcus immediately used his radio to call for additional security personnel and contact the city's animal control services. We retreated to the security office and waited for help to arrive. During the next hour, we could hear movement throughout the building that suggested whatever was in the ventilation system was becoming more active and less concerned about remaining hidden. When the animal control officers arrived, they brought equipment for dealing with large animals that might have taken shelter in the building during the extreme cold. They also brought tranquilizer guns and protective gear, indicating that they were prepared for potentially dangerous wildlife. The search of the building took 4 hours and involved accessing ventilation shafts, utility spaces, and areas between floors that are normally sealed off from human access. The animal control officers found evidence of occupancy in several locations, including nesting materials and food remains that suggested something had been living in the building for an extended period. But they never found the creature itself. Whatever had been moving through the building's infrastructure had apparently left during the time we were waiting for help to arrive. The animal control officers collected samples of the evidence they found and promised to analyze them to determine what kind of animal had been using the building as shelter. The results of their analysis were inconclusive. The nesting materials included substances that were not consistent with any known urban wildlife, and the food remains included items that no local animal would have been able to obtain or digest. The scratch marks and footprints were also inconsistent with any species normally found in Minneapolis. The building management company installed additional security measures, including motion sensors in the ventilation system and cameras in areas that had previously been unmonitored. They also sealed access points that might have allowed animals to enter the building from outside. I returned to my normal duties after a week of administrative leave, but the building felt different during my night rounds. The unusual sounds and movements stopped, but I never felt completely alone during my shifts. I had the persistent feeling that something was watching me from spaces I could not see, waiting for the right opportunity to resume its activities. 3 months later, during another period of extreme cold, the scratching sounds returned. This time, building management took my report seriously from the beginning, and they immediately contacted animal control services. But once again, despite extensive searching, no creature was found. I still work security in downtown Minneapolis, but I have requested reassignment to buildings that do not have extensive ventilation systems or utility spaces where large animals could hide. Experience taught me that cities harbor forms of life that are not documented in any wildlife guides, and that some of these creatures are intelligent enough to avoid detection while sharing space with human activities. I encourage other security personnel to trust their instincts when they encounter unusual sounds or signs of animal activity in buildings. Document everything, report incidents immediately, and do not hesitate to request backup when dealing with situations that feel dangerous or beyond normal experience. The creature I encountered in those downtown buildings was never identified or captured. And for all I know, it is still moving through the underground spaces that connect Minneapolis buildings, avoiding detection while adapting to urban life in ways that urban planners never anticipated. My name is Mary, and I moved to what I thought was the perfect suburban neighborhood in Savannah. I learned that perfection can hide the darkest secrets. I am a marketing coordinator who had been living in downtown Savannah for 3 years when I decided I wanted something quieter, safer, and more family-oriented. I was 31 years old, single, and starting to think about buying my first house instead of renting apartments. The neighborhood called Magnolia Gardens seemed like exactly what I was looking for. Magnolia Gardens was a planned community built in the early 2000s, featuring identical Georgian-style homes with white columns, manicured lawns, and tree-lined streets that created a picture-perfect American suburb. The houses were all painted in coordinated colors approved by the Homeowners Association, and every yard was maintained to the same immaculate standard. It looked like something from a magazine about successful suburban living. I found a house on Azalea Drive through a real estate agent who specialized in the community. The house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath colonial with hardwood floors, granite countertops, and a 2-car garage. The previous owners had been transferred to another city for work, and they were motivated to sell quickly. The price was reasonable for the Savannah market, and the agent assured me that Magnolia Gardens was one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the area. The Homeowners Association was active and well organized, according to the marketing materials. They maintained common areas, organized community events, and enforced standards that preserved property values. There was a community center with a pool, tennis courts, and meeting rooms available to residents. The neighborhood also had its own security patrol that made regular rounds to ensure safety and tranquility. I moved into the house on a Saturday in early September, and my first impression was overwhelmingly positive. The neighbors who came to introduce themselves were friendly and welcoming. They brought cookies, offered to help with unpacking, and invited me to join the weekly book club and monthly potluck dinners. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to have a new resident, and they were eager to tell me about all the wonderful aspects of living in Magnolia Gardens. The neighborhood had traditions and rituals that brought residents together. There were seasonal decorating contests, charity drives, and holiday celebrations that were well attended and enthusiastically supported. Children played safely on the streets, couples walked their dogs along the sidewalks, and families gathered in their driveways for evening conversations while washing cars or tending gardens. For the first month, everything was exactly as advertised. I settled into a routine of walking through the neighborhood each evening after work, greeting neighbors who were outside, and feeling grateful that I had found such a wonderful place to live. The houses were beautiful, the people were kind, and the atmosphere was peaceful and secure. The Homeowners Association held a welcome reception for new residents during my second month in the neighborhood. It was held at the community center on a Thursday evening, and nearly every household was represented. The association president, a woman named Helen Morrison who lived on Dogwood Lane, gave a presentation about community guidelines, upcoming events, and the importance of maintaining the standards that made Magnolia Gardens special. During the reception, I met more neighbors and learned about their backgrounds and interests. There were teachers, accountants, small business owners, retirees, and young families with children. Everyone seemed genuinely committed to the community and proud of what they had built together. The conversation was pleasant and engaging, and I left the reception feeling more connected to my new neighborhood than I had ever felt anywhere else I had lived. It was during my third month that I began to notice subtle things that seemed slightly unusual. During my evening walks, I observed that many of the neighbors were outside at exactly the same times each day, engaged in exactly the same activities. The man on Camellia Street washed his car every Tuesday and Friday at 6 p.m. The woman on Dogwood Lane watered her flowers every day at 5:30 p.m. The elderly couple on Rose Avenue sat on their porch swing every evening from 7 to 8 p.m. At first, I assumed this was simply the natural rhythm of suburban life, with people developing routines that fit their schedules and preferences. But as I paid more attention, I realized the timing was too precise and the activities too consistent to be entirely natural. It was as if everyone was following a schedule that had been carefully coordinated. I also noticed the conversations with neighbors had a repetitive quality. People would ask the same questions in the same order and give responses that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. When I mentioned current events or personal experiences from outside the neighborhood, residents would politely acknowledge what I said, but then steer the conversation back to topics related to Magnolia Gardens. The most unusual aspect of these interactions was that neighbors seemed to know details about my daily routine that I had never shared with anyone. They would comment on what time I left for work, what I had purchased at the grocery store, or what television shows I watched, despite the fact that my house was not visible from their properties, and I had never discussed these details. During my fourth month, I decided to test my growing suspicions about the neighborhood. I deliberately changed my evening walk routine, taking different routes and varying the times when I went outside. I also started paying closer attention to who was watching me and how they reacted to my presence. The results were disturbing. No matter which route I took or what time I walked, I would encounter the same neighbors engaged in outdoor activities that gave them perfect vantage points to observe my movements. If I walked early, people would be outside earlier than usual. If I took a different street, Residents on that street would suddenly have reasons to be in their front yards. I also realized that the activities themselves were often unnecessary or illogical. People would be watering plants that had just been watered, washing cars that were already clean, or checking mailboxes that had already been checked. The activities were pretexts for surveillance, not genuine household maintenance. The situation escalated during my 5th month, when I decided to skip my evening walk entirely and instead observe the neighborhood from my bedroom window. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions about Magnolia Gardens and its residents. Without me outside to observe, the elaborate performance of normal suburban life simply stopped. People who had been engaged in yard work abandoned their activities and went inside. Children who had been playing on the streets disappeared. The carefully choreographed tableau of community life revealed itself to be exactly that. A performance designed to create the illusion of normalcy for my benefit. I watched for 2 hours, and during that time, I saw residents moving between houses through backyards, clearly communicating with each other about my absence from the evening routine. Lights in houses would go on and off in patterns that seemed to be signals rather than normal household lighting. Cars would move from one driveway to another, suggesting that some residents were maintaining multiple properties to create the impression of higher occupancy. Most disturbing of all, I saw people going in and out of houses that were supposed to be occupied by different families, indicating that the neighborhood demographics I had been told about were largely fictional. The woman who had introduced herself as a teacher living alone on Magnolia Street was also the elderly grandmother who supposedly lived with her son's family on Dogwood Lane. I realized that I was the only genuine resident of Magnolia Gardens, and that everyone else was participating in an elaborate deception designed to convince me that I was living in a normal suburban community. The question was why, and what they planned to do once they had achieved whatever their goal was. I began documenting everything I observed, taking photographs from my windows and keeping detailed notes about the patterns of behavior I witnessed. I also started researching the history of Magnolia Gardens and discovered that the community had a much more complex background than I had been told. The neighborhood had been built by a development company that went bankrupt shortly after construction was completed. The houses had been sold at auction to a group of investors who had never disclosed their identities or their plans for the property. Public records showed that all the houses were owned by the same limited liability company, despite the fact that residents claimed to be individual homeowners. I also learned that several people had moved into Magnolia Gardens over the past 5 years, but none of them had ever moved out or sold their houses. According to county records, I was the only person who had ever actually purchased a house in the neighborhood through normal real estate channels. Armed with this information, I decided to confront the situation directly. During the next homeowners association meeting, I asked pointed questions about property ownership, resident backgrounds, and the financial structure of the community. The responses I received were evasive and inconsistent, and I could see that my questions were making people uncomfortable. After the meeting, Helen Morrison approached me privately and suggested that I was asking too many questions and should focus on enjoying the benefits of living in such a wonderful community. Her tone was friendly, but there was an underlying threat that made it clear I was expected to stop investigating. That night, I decided to leave Magnolia Gardens immediately. I packed essential belongings and drove to a hotel in downtown Savannah, planning to return during daylight hours with help to collect the rest of my possessions. I had no intention of spending another night in a neighborhood where I was the subject of organized surveillance and deception. When I returned the next morning with a moving truck and 2 friends to help me pack, I found that my house had been cleaned out completely. All of my furniture, clothing, and personal belongings had been removed, and the house had been restored to the same spotless condition it had been in when I first toured it. Even my mail and personal documents had been taken. The neighbors who came outside to watch the moving truck acted confused about my presence, claiming they had never seen me before and insisting that the house had been vacant for months. When I showed them my purchase documents and identification, they maintained that I must be mistaken about which house I had lived in. I contacted the police and the real estate agent who had sold me the house, but both my purchase documents and the deed had been altered to show that I had bought a completely different property in another part of Savannah. My bank records showed payments for a house on a street that did not exist, and my insurance policy covered a property that could not be located. The investigation revealed that I had been the victim of an elaborate real estate fraud, but the people responsible had covered their tracks so thoroughly that no criminal charges could be filed. I was told that these types of scams were becoming more common, with criminals creating fake neighborhoods to steal money from unsuspecting buyers. I never learned the true purpose of Magnolia Gardens or what the people there had planned to do with me if I had stayed longer. I assumed they were running some kind of long-term fraud that required maintaining the illusion of a normal suburban community, and I had unknowingly become part of their operation. I now live in a different part of Savannah, in a neighborhood where I have verified the identities and backgrounds of my neighbors through public records. I have learned to be suspicious of any community that seems too perfect, and I always research property ownership and resident demographics before making any major housing decisions. My experience at Magnolia Gardens taught me that criminals can create convincing facades that fool even careful people, and that the appearance of safety and normalcy can hide dangerous deceptions. I share this story as a warning to others about the importance of thorough research and the danger of trusting appearances when making major life decisions.